Animals people keep for meat that you might not expect. On this channel we've covered the various cattle, chicken, sheep and goat breeds. But what about the lesser-known animals that are actively reared and farmed for meat? Get yourself comfortable, this is going to be a fun one, full of weird, wacky and amazing animals that have been feeding civilizations for as long as humans have been around. Let's get into it. Starting with the aquatic animals first, since most of them require similar conditions in which to be farmed, and all of them are enormous industries that we often overlook. Mollusks, oysters, mussels and clams have been farmed for centuries, though it's only been in the last few decades that we've really figured out the most efficient ways to do it. They need to live and breed in the ocean, very much like eels do. Eels, unfortunately we can't replicate the eel's reproductive passage through the ocean. Their breeding is reliant on being on the move through specific currents, and they can only do so under the right temperatures and conditions. We're still not entirely sure how eels mate, to be honest, because no one's observed them at it before. So the juveniles are collected en masse and brought to tanks where they mature until they're big enough for harvest. This isn't a sustainable way to farm any kind of animal, since these mass harvests of juveniles seriously endanger the numbers of new young eels going back into the ocean. It's not our favorite form of farming on this list, that's for sure. Crabs and sea urchins, though challenging to rear like all of the aquatic livestock are much less complicated than the eels. Mud crabs are by far the most popular, easy breeding and fast-growing crab species to raise. Octopodes and squid are a completely different ballgame altogether. Until recently, it was thought that it would be impossible to do because they both have complex reproductive habits and unusual life cycles. Are we even surprised though? If ever an alien species arrived on Earth by hitching a ride on a comet, then it's the octopus. But in the last few years, Spain and Japan have managed to make some incredible discoveries, and with their recent experiments, it really looks like this will be a viable aquatic farming venture in the near future. So, if this is something that interests you, now's the time to look into it while there's still funding available. And to round off our aquatic segment, we can't move on to the next category without mentioning frogs. The most popular breed to work with is the American bullfrog, due to its size and meat yield. Of all the water-reliant livestock, frogs are one of the easiest to work with. They breed and feed without difficulty, and they're pretty healthy and hardy too. Capybara, the infamously friendly animals that so willingly pose for photos with tourists, are pretty easy to work with since they aren't prone to violence or disease. There are limitations to who can actively farm them, and the venture requires many permits and permissions because they're technically a protected species. So if you don't live in Brazil or Venezuela, chances are that capybara production isn't going to be an option for you. They aren't just farmed for their meat. The furs are very valuable too. Porcupines definitely fall into a niche field of expertise, and it's not for the novice. Predictably, those valuable quills require a knowledgeable handler, who isn't afraid of receiving a few injuries annually. The real issue lies in their slow reproductive rate. Females give birth to only 1 or 2 porcupets a year. And yes, the babies really are porcupets. Have you ever even heard of a cuter term for a teeny tiny spined ball of pain? How adorable. Back to the high level of danger and the slow breeding rates though. This drives up their selling price enormously. And the only reason that it's allowed most of the time is with the intention of getting their numbers up in the wild somewhat. It's not that porcupines are nearing extinction just yet, but a great amount of illegal poaching has placed them on many watch lists. Intensively farming any kind of animal is a fantastic way to encourage interest from the public as well as upping their populations. The thick layer of fat and muscle on their backs that keep the spines in place make their meat tender, rich, and most closely comparable to wild boar. Think game meat, but with more fat. The nutria, more commonly referred to as coipu, originates from South America just like the capybara does, but farming them extends outside of the continent all the way to the USA and Europe. And like the capybara, their meat and fur are both in high demand. But the two, though very similar, differ in one specific aspect: population. The capybara's status is protected and controlled, but the coipu is incredibly populous. They're even considered invasive in some places. So instead of using farming to increase their numbers, it's utilized to curb their increasing populations. A female can give birth up to 3 times a year, with 5 to 9 pups present at every birth. That's a lot of meat and fur, or a lot of rodents running around to decimate major crop fields. This is definitely a more productive way to keep staple crops safe, while managing a potentially destructive rodent population. Guinea pigs have been a traditional part of the population's diet in most South American countries for centuries, but there's more money to be made than just their meat. The pet trade for the friendly, easy-to-care-for fluffy little creatures is huge. Then there's the rather unpleasant reality that pharmaceutical companies are willing to pay big bucks for the animals to partake in medical trials and testing. Like we said, it's not a pleasant thought, but it is a reality that a huge percentage of guinea pig sales go to big pharma, and unfortunately we cannot avoid mentioning such a major export regarding any species of animal. Muskrats and coypoos resemble each other so much that the two are almost indistinguishable from one another. Muskrats, however, pose an even bigger problem with their enormously high populations and their ability to adapt to any environment. Back in the day, their fur was highly sought after, and Europeans brought them back from the United States to breed them more intensively. Predictably, the muskrats burrowed out of their enclosures, and now they are an invasive species all over Europe, Asia, and South America. There is a market for the meat, though it's small. The fur is much more lucrative since it's such a good insulator against the cold. Farming muskrats isn't as simple as its close cousin the coypoo though. They're semi-aquatic and need ponds and marshy habitats to thrive, so they aren't exactly the cheapest form of farming to get into, purely based on the infrastructure needed to get started. Moving away from the rodents and onto the marsupials, let's begin with the kangaroos. The kangaroo population in Australia is enormous just because they're exclusively found in the land down under. Don't make the mistake of thinking that they're rare at all. Besides wild herds that can be hunted under permit conditions, there are some pretty significant farms in the country. The meat from kangaroo is of a stellar quality. Some of our most muscled breeds of cattle are also the ones who produce the best cuts. Have you seen a kangaroo's muscular development? These creatures are the ultimate gym bros of nature, and you can bet that their product packs as much of a punch as their biceps do. Their leather is highly sought after too, and in an era where most products are made from synthetic materials like polyester, their leather is some of the few that genuinely still has a demand to drive sales. Farming them isn't much different from working with any other grazer. If anything, it's easier to graze them solely on grassland, since they can digest twice the amount of variation that cattle can. Now we're having a look at some of the reptiles. Turtle farming is quite common in many Asian countries, with the Chinese softshell turtle being the most common species to focus on. Besides the meat itself, the eggs and even the shells are all sellable, so every part of the animal is marketable. Snake farming, particularly for pythons, is a well-established industry in Thailand and Vietnam. The skins and snake oil made from them are even more profitable than the meat itself, and they're actually a very sustainable source of protein for large populations simply because python rearing doesn't take up much room, and the infrastructure isn't as complicated as we might think. The tropical climates in the countries where they're farmed takes away the expensive light and moisture controlling contraptions that we'd normally need in other parts of the world. It would be monumentally expensive to set up an operation outside of tropical areas, so this one is a climate-specific venture, we're afraid to say. Alligator and crocodile farms normally double as a tourist attraction, with viewing areas, gift shops, and restaurants taking the forefront of the operation. The majority of our viewers have probably visited such a place, or at least know of one somewhere in their country. The truth is, the river lizards are farmed all over the world. Southern Africa, Asia, the USA, Australia, and most of South America has set up shop mostly because of the valuable leather trade. The tourism and meat made from alligators and crocodiles is more of a side hustle than a major source of income. Iguanas, on the other hand, are exclusively farmed for their protein and their marketability as exotic pets. Only very rarely are their skins used for leather products. The green iguana is the most commonly farmed species because it grows fast and large, and it's an extremely adaptable creature too. Like with the pythons, the tropical environments of South America make it possible to keep them with little to no specialized infrastructure. This is one of those unusual animals that we actually encourage people to farm. The exotic pet trade is a deplorable practice, and iguanas are some of the most widely traded animals on the black market. Making them more readily available for legal sale is the best way to destroy these illegal animal traders from going out and eradicating them in their natural habitat. Let's flip the tropical climate coin and head up north for a visit, shall we? Here you'll find plenty of Santa's sleigh pullers. Reindeer were some of the first animals in human history to be domesticated way over in Russia and Mongolia. Skip over a few thousand years, all the way to our modern day, and there are scores of countries that still herd reindeer for their meat, velvet, and skins. All of the Scandinavian countries, Russia, Mongolia, China, Canada, and Alaska, have productive herds. But most importantly, it's a vital form of trade for indigenous groups in all of these countries. Their significance doesn't stop at their monetary value, it's a way of life that's intricately tied to survival, culture, and traditions. Sadly, for any of you interested in getting into reindeer herding, this isn't like running a ranch at all. Get your snowshoes on and get used to living off the land as you move through the snowy wilderness with your herd. Yak domestication shares a lot of similarities with the reindeer, taking place around the same time in the Tibet mountains. They're a little easier to manage than the reindeer and more valuable in terms of the amount of trade that can be gotten from them. Milk, meat, fiber, hides, and even the dung for a sellable fuel source. Yak are excellent pack animals too, and they can be reared in the same way cattle are, or as a traveling herd like they're still traditionally raised in some places. A lot of our viewers might be deeply disturbed to hear that horses are a major livestock animal in Europe and Asia. Our image of horses as companions and working partners have led most countries to veer away from using them as livestock. But the reality is that horses have been with man for centuries too. And like the yaks and the reindeer, they've served many purposes, including meat production. They're still a major protein in countries like Kazakhstan, France, Belgium, Italy, Japan, and most of the Nordic nations. Camels are still the main source of meat and dairy in many Middle Eastern and North African countries. The dairy especially is highly nutritious and still serves as a staple food in these regions. Australia, West Africa, East Africa, and India all farm camels. Camel trade is more lucrative than any other livestock in arid areas where the heavy hitters like cattle and horses just can't thrive. Besides meat and milk, their hides are prized, they're great pack animals, they're an integral part of the tourism industry, and they even partake in races. Subsistence farmers, tribal villages, and the commercial market, camels tick all of the boxes that would take several species of livestock for us. This is a productive livestock animal that we can absolutely get behind. Their cultural and traditional importance to the societies that raise them are so integral to the people's lives that camels have been treated exceptionally well when compared to the horror stories that have followed all of the other major breeds. Camels aren't just important, they're the backbone of North Africa, the Middle East, and West African civilizations, and they're definitely here to stay. Buffalo is a wide spectrum. There are 4 major breeds in the species. First, let's look at the Great American Buffalo. They're technically a kind of bison, but we've been referring to them as buffalo for so long, and the two are close genetic relatives, so we won't stress the technicalities too much here. American buffalo were nearly hunted to extinction. In the last century, several attempts have been made to reintroduce them to the wild with limited success. That's until actively farming them for meat production was brought up. With a great deal of government funding and support, we've finally seen some positive growth in their populations and successful reintroductions into the grasslands where they belong. This is the kind of venture that you need to get into early, while governmental funding is still on the table to aid a movement that's already successful enough that outside help won't be necessary for much longer. Water buffalo are probably the most commonly farmed of the lot. Originating from Asia, there are several subspecies in this group. They're all farmed for their dairy, meat, and hides. And in a lot of cases they're used as draft animals too. African buffalo are not actively farmed, though it is allowed to hunt them with special permits on occasion. They're just too wild and dangerous to domesticate even partially. Then there's the beefalo, the buffalo and cattle hybrid that gives double the carcass weight and a great deal of dairy too. The hybrids have been around for quite a few years, but it's only in the last 30 years or so that the practice has really picked up pace, becoming a fully fledged commercial-level protein supplier. They're not really an option outside of the USA, since most other countries supply their populations with mostly small-scale farms while the rest is left for wild native herds to migrate and roam on freely. Beefalo need an enormous amount of space that most countries just don't have. We need to make some honorable mentions before we bid you adieu. There are a handful of sea creatures that are so rarely actively farmed that they aren't worth mentioning. The llamas, alpacas, ostriches, and emus are relatively well known, and it's common knowledge that people do eat their products. Snails and crickets have been around for quite some time too. Crickets had a big boost a few years ago, but it failed to get much traction for the human market after that initial fad ran its course. They're slowly slipping back to a high-protein food source for animal feed, but even then the marketability is limited. Then there are the canines, cats and various insect types too. If you don't mind, we'd rather not get into the deplorable conditions that pets are bred and slaughtered in. Almost every country in the world has banned the practice, not because of ethical concerns, it's because it's a safety hazard. The trade of canines especially is impossible to regulate, and the amount of contamination that occurs in those operations are nothing short of hair-raising. The various insects that nearly made our list are too many to count. Unfortunately, they're all niche markets or early stages of experimentation that aren't worth looking into just yet. Or maybe we've missed a few interesting species of animal that our viewers can remind us of. Let us know about some of the more exotic meats and products you've seen or tried. You know how much we appreciate our viewers' take on the topic of the day. And while you're at it, why not leave a like and subscribe before you go? We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.